In December 2019, a novel coronavirus was identified in Wuhan, China. The U.S. had its first case 1 month later, and the first case on a university campus in the country was reported just days afterward. By the end of January 2020, the World Health Organization declared the virus a public health emergency of international concern. On March 11, it was a global pandemic. One by one, U.S. higher education institutions began shuttering their campuses, converting an average of over 500 courses each to online delivery, and turning students away to learn remotely. Such non-traditional education has been called a back door to higher learning. In the spring of 2020, it became the only door. I'm Leanne Dickerson, and in this presentation, I propose a comparative longitudinal case study to explore the response of higher education to the exogenous shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll examine the elements, interactions, and purposes of the distance education systems put in place, and investigate the implications for online distance education moving forward. Thank you for joining me. Back in the fall of 2002, an estimated 1.6 million U.S. post-secondary students were taking one or more online distance courses. By 2018, that number had risen to 6.9 million, over 1/3 of the total 19.6 million post-secondary students. And 3.2 million of those were enrolled exclusively in distance education courses. This rapid rise in enrollments has contributed to many scholars calling online distance education mainstream. But while it's certainly become widespread, distance education has some persistent difficulties, a unique peculiarity, and a recurring problem that arguably prevent it from being called mainstream. Distance education is both a practice and a field of inquiry with a rich history that predates the internet by centuries. Distance education is also a system that has adapted throughout its history to changing social and political conditions. At the same time, it's been shaped by evolving learning theories and technologies. Online distance education is a type of distance education with roots in that broader category. One of the persistent challenges for distance education has been what to call it. It's been called independent study or correspondence education. And more recently, it's been called by its technologies, including e-learning or online learning. There is noted confusion about the terminology in the literature, but even more seriously, the literature also contains some serious criticisms of the quality of distance education research, and often a lack of theoretical basis. Compounding both of these difficulties is the fact that online distance education has grown by leaps and bounds faster than the quality research to guide it, which means that many of the gaps are filled with an abundance of how-to guides and best practices, which are not the same as peer-reviewed research. One peculiar reality for distance education is that the U.S. tends to favor a craft model. In a craft model, individual faculty build and deliver their courses. But other countries more often leverage a systems approach. In a systems model, there's a clear division of labor. For an online distance course, for example, faculty, instructional designers, and production and technology specialists all bring specialized skills to course design and instruction. It's a team-based approach. When U.S. higher ed institutions moved courses to online formats en masse in the spring of 2020, most of the work was done by individual faculty. One recurring problem for distance education across its history is faculty resistance. In the past 3 decades particularly, the explosion of online technologies has meant that faculty need to use tools and teaching methods that are substantially different from any teacher-centered or traditional approach they might have previously relied on. In the fall of 2019, just under half of higher education faculty had ever taught a distance education course online, which means that when colleges and universities decided to replace their in-person instruction with remote learning, the majority of faculty had no previous experience with online distance education courses. Not many researchers could or likely would have proposed an experimental swap of one major mechanism for another that's been dogged by research confusion and that's largely composed of individually crafted elements in a system widely unaccepted or unexperienced by those who are going to be called upon to do the work. But this is precisely what happened. And so what we have before us is a wicked problem. How is distance education working at scale? How are our theories doing now that they're in large-scale practice? And we have before us a research opportunity. Crisis can be a catalyst for a new perspective. It can be a chance to examine assumptions, or refine constructs, or improve practice. This study has the potential for all three. It's an opportunity for more than the micro-level research that has dominated the distance education literature. Theorists have thought about distance education as a system for quite some time, but in practice, and in the micro-level research that represents practice, the system's view is less often adopted, which I think leaves holes in what we know. I want to look at the system, and I'm proposing these research questions. First, how do the elements of the distance education system interact with each other, and for what purposes during COVID-19? And second, how can distance education system functioning during the COVID-19 crisis inform effective distance education operations after the pandemic? I propose that this study can bridge a gap between theory and practice and contribute to better aligning the two. And the findings of this study have the potential to help online distance education improve. To answer the research questions, this study will explore 4 U.S. higher education institutions that have been purposefully selected for the variety of views they offer. 1 Midwestern private 4-year institution, 1 Southern public 2-year institution, 1 Southern public 4-year HBCU, and 1 Southern private 4-year institution. 3 of the research sites are 4-year institutions, and the 4th one is a 2-year college. 2 of the sites are private institutions and 2 are public. 1 of the institutions is an HBCU. 2 are located in the Appalachian region of the country, where the percentage of households with broadband internet access is below the national average. 1 of the institutions has no prior experience with distance education. None. All this doctoral journey time, I envisioned a nice, tidy, quantitative dissertation for myself. But then COVID-19 happened, and what could I do? I saw an opportunity for exploration, and I knew I had a case study on my hands. Others saw opportunity for exploration too, and so a research team was born. My proposed study is embedded in a larger 2-year study of this research team, where I'm a co-investigator with 3 of my professors on a comparative longitudinal case study from April 2020 to April 2022 that's examining the research sites before and after COVID-19. Like any good case study, the early data is rich. Longitudinal lets us look at the situation over time. Comparative lets us compare points in time as the situation changes and participants start reflecting on their experience. There's a lot to like about a case study. Case studies are good for complex problems. They're good for studying current events. They're flexible. They look for answers to how and why questions. And they're open to systems thinking. But the greatest strengths of case study for this proposed research are that it can develop theory and it can shed light on the generative mechanisms that causally explain behavior. Study participants serve in a variety of roles at each institution: executive administration, academic leadership, faculty in various disciplines, and library services. I plan to collect primary data in semi-structured interviews at 2 data collection points. First, during the spring and summer academic terms of 2020, this data collection is already underway as part of the larger study in which I'm a co-investigator. And the second interviews will take place during or just after the fall 2020 academic term. I'll also be using secondary data. I want to examine archival material, the documents and communications related to each institution's move to distance operations. These are public items obtained from the institution's websites, particularly their COVID-19 pages, or the documents and communications might be participant-provided materials. Joseph Maxwell said that theory is more than a framework. It's a story about what you think is happening and why. I want to tell that story. I'll be approaching this study from a critical realist perspective, which is a realist ontology and a relativist epistemology. Critical realism was proposed in the 1970s by Roy Bhaskar, and like Bhaskar, I believe that the underlying structures of the distance education system are real entities, though we'll know them imperfectly because we're human. Critical realism allows claims about reality and gives them justification. Critical realism is a nice fit with the systems thinking lens that I'm proposing as a conceptual framework to examine the distance education systems that have been put in place in response to COVID-19. I want to look at system functioning, which means trying to identify the causal mechanisms that promote or inhibit effective distance education. Critical realism acknowledges that causal mechanisms can be abducted and explained. Systems thinking requires that I identify the elements, purposes, and interactions of the systems as I poke my researcher head around in them, and it requires that I think about system boundaries, arrangements and rearrangements, and about causes and effects from different points of view. I believe that transactional distance theory will help me identify the elements and interactions in the system. Transactional distance theory is a theory for distance education that was developed by Michael G. Moore in the 1970s. One of the theory's foundational precepts is that distance is not just a physical space, but a psychological and communication space. The theory was originally intended to describe the relationship between teacher and learner in a distance environment, but it's also been proposed as a global theory for a distance education system, which is how I want to leverage it for this study. I'm identifying potential participants from the institution's public directories on their websites. I've been emailing invitations to participate, and I've interviewed every volunteer so far. The only demographic information I'm collecting is the role, whether they are executive administration, faculty, or staff. In advance of the interview, I'm sending a digital copy of the informed consent form, and I'll send it again before the second round of interviews. These are distance interviews conducted virtually, and I've been reviewing the informed consent and obtaining permission before I start recording. I'm using a licensed virtual meeting software, and participants can call or use video. I'm saving any video only long enough to convert to audio and then deleting the original. I'm transcribing with the help of an artificial intelligence transcription service, omitting any identifying information. Because these interviews are part of a larger study, all of the files are shared with the other investigators on Concordia St. Paul's secure document drive. Even though my proposed study is a subsystem of a larger study, I'll be conducting the data analysis separately. I'll use the qualitative analysis software NVivo. I'm going to use the 3 coding phases of grounded theory: open, axial, and theoretical integration. In open coding, I'm dismantling the data into concepts. In axial coding, I reconstruct it by comparing and relating concepts to each other. And in theoretical integration, I'm looking for the heart of the story, the theory. In the methodological literature, the qualitative researcher is an instrument and a performer. My job is to handle my roles with sensitivity, balancing participant points of view with the demands of the researcher role. And I believe for this study, sensitivity is an advantage over objectivity. I have extensive experience in online distance education. My experience provides me an understanding of what I can expect to find, and it will enhance my sensitivity to the topic, the sites, the participants, and the data analysis and interpretation. For this study, I'm a tuned instrument and a practiced performer. As an ethical researcher, I'm going to have to stay tuned and remember my lines. 4 practices will help me here. First, reflexivity. I'm using memos to myself as an opportunity to evaluate my responses to the research and to adjust where I need to in order to stay focused on the empirical data. Second, my word choices are important. I'm going to be careful about the words I choose for coding and analyzing data and presenting conclusions. Language is merely a mediator of ideas, and I know I need to be as precise as possible. Third, triangulation. I'm triangulating in multiple ways by interviewing participants with different points of view, by interviewing participants at different points in time, by analyzing documents and communications in addition to conducting those interviews, and by consulting with my professors on my research team, as well as this esteemed committee. Fourth, rival explanations. I'm going to thoughtfully consider rival explanations, and systems thinking can help me identify what they are. And my theoretical paradigm requires it. Critical realism demands that I consider rival explanations in a search for theory. Any research study has limitations, and this study's no different. I'll note 4. First, I'm human. The critical realist especially knows this about herself. There will be mistakes, but critical realism accepts these as fallible steps on a knowledge journey. My mistakes won't negate the truth, which I believe is a real thing. Second, I'm limited by what I exclude from the study. Case studies deal in rich data, but I'm bound by time. Critical realists see research itself as a system, and so I will be consciously examining and re-examining boundaries throughout the research. Third, I'm taking a holistic view by approaching distance education as a single case. Some researchers think there's a danger there toward ending up with nothing more than description. But I take the view that only a holistic approach can provide the expansive view necessary for exploring interactions and causal mechanisms. Fourth, some might say that the number of participants, 12 so far, is small. But a critical realist would argue that truth isn't in numbers. It's out there, and a small n doesn't necessarily prevent us from any discovery. And so there are limitations, but I argue that the strengths of the research design outweigh these limitations. To recapitulate, I propose a qualitative, comparative, longitudinal case study situated in critical realist thought, using a systems thinking lens and applying a grounded theory methodology in order to answer the research questions and generate theory to explain the causal mechanisms of distance education by looking at its unprecedented scale during the COVID-19 pandemic. With this study, I can usefully contribute to what is known about distance education systems in the U.S. and help other leaders to improve practice. It's a singular opportunity. It's one I hope we never experience again, but it's a moment we can learn from to make a better distance education future for those who continue to choose it. Thank you.